the 9 days. At the moment, we're in the 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av, which is on Saturday night, then Sunday night. And during this period, there are certain restrictions that are that one should follow regarding uh, doing less fun things and not creating too much joy. So one of the things, as we all know, is one shouldn't eat meat and chicken, but Shabbos is the exception. So this Friday night, on Shabbos day, you can have your meat meal at Shkia, which is actually when the fast starts. So, but also in terms of buying items, one during this period you can buy standard items such as groceries, but you can't go buy gold Rolex and Porsche Cayenne because that'll give you a lot of joy and simcha, and you'd have to probably say Shechianu on the Porsche Cayenne. So it also applies to new clothing, China, fine China, home decor. But if, let's say, for instance, there was a item of clothing on a sale, and the sale was only for one day this week, then you could buy it. And other things you could also buy
Well,
in
the
terms
Porsche
of
Cayenne is actually
clothing.
10% off, Kevin.
Oh, is it? Okay.
No,
Okay.
just thought
So
I'd share that with you.
that's
Sorry.
so the main thing is luxury items, which would, if you buy something like fancy, like it gives you a lot of joy and simcha, and one should reduce one's simcha at this time.
Okay. I'm sure
Right.
I'm sure Sheer from me probably does that equally well than abstaining from, but it is what it is. All right. Let's get started. So so what's actually going to happen now is that the Gemara is trying to show you that this is a later argument by the Amoraim. And the same argument was debated centuries before by the Tanaim. There are actually four generations of Tanaim. So this argument with the Amoraim is Rav Abahu and Rav Yochanan. They obviously came a lot later. So it says, let's say, like, if you look at this bigger issue about breaking a ladder rung while climbing, what have you learned? If a person was ascending a ladder and a rung broke underfoot and killed somebody, there are two conflicting rulings. One brisa teaches that he's liable, while another brisa teaches that he's exempt. So the Gemara is proposing is their disagreement not based on the following. One classifies it as a downward motion and therefore requires exile, as Rav Yochanan rules. Because if you remember, Rav Yochanan rules, it doesn't matter about the intent, it matters about the actual activity happening at the time. Whereas Rav Abahu holds it's about a compound motion. In other words, in order to ascend, you have to crouch down in order to push an object up. And so too in climbing a ladder. You're initially, as you're climbing, your pressure is pushing down, and he sees it as a compound motion. And therefore, he said because it's an upward motion, there's an exemption from exile because anything moving up um, is uh, is classified as accidental as opposed to negligence because you've got to take gravity as to a factor that's going to add a compounding effect. So the Gemara says it doesn't necessarily have to be that clear cut with a Tanoim. In fact, you needn't say that the two Brises of two different opinions. It doesn't mean that the one Bryce is according to Rav Yochanan that says he's liable to exile and Rav Abaye that said he's not. In fact, there's no difficulty or contradiction. What the first Bryce deals with when it says that there's liability is it's talking about damages. So even if you're going up a ladder but you fall off the ladder or a rung comes down from underfoot, and in that particular case, you damage somebody. You might not be liable to go to the city of refuge and have your life turned upside down because nobody died. But it doesn't matter whether you're going up or down, forward or back. If you injured somebody, you have to pay for those injuries. But it's always talking in a public domain where both parties are allowed to enter. If you're busy plastering the roof of your house and some idiot, some Bible salesman comes to tell you the word of JC and comes to sell you Bibles or crockery or whatever the case may be, but he's just entered your property and he ends up getting badly injured on your property where he has no permission to be, or more importantly, on a construction site, in that particular case, there's no liability. However, if there's negligence and it's almost it might be in your home, but an area where people may enter to get initial contact with you, like a doorbell, and it's in a suburban area that isn't walled off, then there is liability for uh, what do you call it, medical bills and other sort of damage. As far as the second Bryce is concerned, talking about exile, it obviously talks about a case where victim was killed, and therefore, in the case where it rules an exemption to exile, it obviously sees it um, that you actually went in an upward motion, but the rung underneath happened to give way because of a manufacturing default, not that it was a rotten rung or a damaged rung, but you were in an upward motion. And also, it sees a different fact. It says that there's a difference between the person that's the instrument of somebody's death and when you're going in an upward motion and that rung happens to slip off, where that instrument is a separation between the person causing the damage and the rung that actually strikes and kills somebody. So that's another fact to consider. So the Gemara says there's another possible explanation. You could say that this Bryce and that Bryce can refer to exile. In other words, a case where somebody was killed. Still, there's not really a difficulty because in the one case um, where which requires exile, it says, look, the rung itself of a ladder wasn't an aluminium ladder; it was a wooden ladder, and therefore it was worm eaten. You can think of termite eaten or worm eaten or whatever the case may be, and therefore, as you put your foot on it, it sagged downward, and immediately at that point, you should have held on. Um, um, if you could have. But the point of it is, even if you're going in an upward motion, if you're holding up Rav Yochanan, it doesn't matter whether it's a downward motion to an upward motion. The downward action is what's going to cause it, not the overall compound intent of going down to going up. So it doesn't matter if it was almost the instrument of death was the rung or the person itself. But in a worm-eaten rung, even Rav Abahu would say you're liable to exile for a different reason. Is that in that particular case, even he would suggest that there was gross negligence that you didn't take the ladder, and on that basis alone, he would say you're liable to exile, and then he would be going like a buy because what of the opinion of Rabba for gross negligence? In that particular case, you wouldn't even be allowed to go to exile because you don't deserve the atonement aspect nor the protection from the Goel Adam. But the only reason why he's liable to exile is that his body didn't cause it, and there was a separation between the instrument of death and the person. But either which way, even Rav Abayu says that when it's a downward motion, go doing an upward motion, but you're not even getting that upward trajectory because the rung starts to sag. That is also qualified as a downward motion in a case of a worm-eaten rung. Okay. So just to give you a bottom line here, is that if we're going to get a little bit technical, and you go to the opinion of the Ritva and how he explains Rashi, is that it generally follows Rav Abayu because both Bryces accept that where there's a compound motion, where the rung moving down and the person is moving up, we judge the person separately from the rung. It's not like a person was going up and he fell on the person. So since the person is moving up, he's exempt from exile. Okay, and where there is exile, it's a case of it obviously being rotten, and therefore it's downward before he even has a chance to boost himself up. Okay, so if you look according to all the opinions, it generally goes according to Rav Abahu. Um, but as far as the rotten rung is concerned, um, even Rav Abayu would have a difficulty in explaining the negligence aspect, according to the Ritva. Okay, so The last point that you've got to bear in mind is you could also say, the Gemara said there's another option. If you look at this brisa and the brisa referring to rungs, let's just say they're not worm eaten. How would you explain the difficulty? So, in an exemption of exile, it refers to a rung that was securely attached, and the rung doesn't move downward at all. And what we're basically saying there is that if it wasn't securely attached, it's going to snap off, and then your foot will go down before you have a chance to go up. So we're saying you don't necessarily need an example of a wooden ladder. Any sort of um, defect would require exile. But what would be determined in that case is it a manufacturing defect, at which case it's not your fault, or is it negligence that you should have checked the ladder beforehand and therefore there is culpability on the person that is the perpetrator of an accidental death? Okay, fairly straightforward. I don't need to explain that further. We're going into a new mission. I'm just going to share it with you guys. A second, just give me one sec. Okay, share screen. Okay. So Gavin, you want to read it?
If it's not losses.
Okay.
If the iron axe slipped from its handle while he was chopping and killed a bystander, Rabbi says he is not exiled, but the sages say he is exiled. If the death was caused by a wood chip ejected from the tree that was being chopped, Rabbi says he is exiled, but the sages say he's not exiled. The Gemara would explain the basis of their decision.
Okay. That's fine. So when you're reading it in the art scroll, it says rabbi, but obviously all opinions use the term Rebbe, by the way. So if we just analyze the case on superficial look, if the iron axe head slipped from its handle when he was chopping and killed a bystander, why would you think that Rebbe says that he's not exiled, guys? And the sages say he is exiled. What is the sages' thought as to why he's exiled, and why would Rebbe say he's not exiled? Anybody has it to take a guess?
I can't think,
Yeah.
sorry.
Well, it's one is one they could be seen as intentional or unintentional.
Okay,
That's
can you
the
be specific to Rebbe and specific for the sages of how they would see it?
Rebbe says it is intentional, and the sages say it's unintentional.
And if so, what is if it means that Rebbe says it's intentional? What does that actually? What's the ramification? Just follow the logical sequencing. Just explain it for us.
Uh, then it's liable for causing a homicide, liable for homicide.
Okay, is that in the
If
first case of the mission or the second case?
of this one here.
Yeah, there's two opposite cases.
Uh, I see the second part.
Okay, well, you know
I
what,
mean,
Kev,
Jesus, it's not so simple.
it's not so
It looks,
exactly. It's
it's as
not so.
easy when you say it, when you gave it across. Yeah, it's, I have to look at it and try to think.
Well, the top one is more expected. A Rebbe is saying that, listen, you should have prepped better. You can do that because you can check your equipment and all that type of stuff in advance. Therefore, it's more gross negligence. Whereby the one where the wood chipped off, that's not in such a way gross negligence. According to him, the rabbi say it is negligence because if you're in a public area or something, you should have expected something like that to happen.
Okay, good, Gavin. Kevin obviously articulated it. Kevin was on the right thought process. And then any other thoughts? Aidan, Mr. Simpson, anybody else?
Maybe the rabbis view the maybe they're viewing the axe like going forward and uh like the sages are viewing it going backwards or something like that.
Good guess, but here we're dealing with two opposite cases. So, just to give you a bit of almost a preview, if you've got an axe and the head slipped off from the handle. As far as the sages are concerned, the reason he'd go to exile is because there is a small degree of negligence, but as Gavin Simpson said, if a Jew died, this is a hectic thing. You can't just next day go to a party and it's all okay. You have to be able to have your life put upside down and go to the city of refuge. And because there is a degree of negligence, you need to be able to have protection from the victim's relatives, from the Goel Adam. Rebbe says that in that case, the perpetrator is not exiled because it's bordering on gross negligence, as Gavin Stoller said, because you should check. And if the axe iron head slipped from the handle, it was obviously loose. It was obviously loose. At what point did it slip? If it slipped when you hit, for example, a tree, then the tree could have dislodged it. But then it would have been stuck in the tree. It couldn't have flung off from there and then had the momentum to kill somebody. It would have just hit a tree and then either fallen off, but most of the impact would have been taken on the tree. If it actually slipped off the handle, that's for sure gross negligence, and you're not entitled to have the protection of the city of refuge, nor the spiritual respite of the atonement that it offers. That's in the first case. In the second case, if the death was caused by a wood chip ejected from the tree that was being chopped, Rebbe says he's exiled, and the reason saying, look, if you take an axe and it's in reasonable condition, and you hit a tree and a wood chip flies off and kills somebody, there's a degree of negligence to the degree that it's a public area, and any sort of activity that can have a dangerous component. If a Jew dies, there is a negligence in a public space because you should be scrupulously careful and assume that another person could be injured, could. And therefore, because it's not gross, but there is a degree of negligence, there is exile for atonement. You do have to put your life on pause in order to get atonement. And you do need protection from the Goel Adam because it's not gross negligence. It was a terrible thing to happen, but you don't deserve to be killed by the relatives for it. But the sages say, in that case, the perpetrator is not killed. Why? Because he's not even a perpetrator. If a chip came off, it's bordering on complete accidental. It is so unusual that a chip like that could do it. And even if you say it's possible, the reality is there was no negligence involved. Firstly, it's grom, it's indirect. There's no negligence, and therefore it's bordering on the accidental. So why should the person have their life turned upside down nor get protection from the relatives? Because the relatives will not be allowed to kill him because the Sanhedrin will deem it to be an accident. That's the bottom line from the Mishnah. Okay.
Yeah,
Now,
Dave, just one thing.
sure, Gav.
I find the first part actually quite difficult because it sounds easy, it's very simple. But the problem is over here is like just imagine like you say you checked before you started chopping. Then you chop again, chop again, chop again. On the 50th chop, it slips from the axe and boom, kills someone. So according to this opinion over here, you're actually going to be liable for exile, but you did check. You can't check every single swing. It's like, you check your brakes when you go out. You can't check it every single time you go out for a drive. Is that what's expected from this particular understanding? It doesn't seem logical to me.
Okay, so it's your view would go according to the sages here. I'll tell you why. Because as you quite rightly pointed out the other day, the fact that you were chosen to be the instrument of somebody else's death meant that there's something inherently spiritually flawed within you to be able to be a conduit for such a thing, whether in this world or a previous. And generally, if something happens, we believe spiritually it's not a vacuum. There's a difference between negligence and being a conduit. And the fact of it is what you said the other day is you can't just continue in party mode. You have to be able then to have the opportunity to atone. But what you're saying is that, so the reason why in the first case you would not go according to Rebbe is the reason Rebbe says he's not exiled is he deserves to be killed by the relatives and he's not entitled to atonement. So you would have to go with one opinion or the other. There's only one of the two. And the sages say, listen, a Jew died. whether or not there was negligence or not, because a Jew died, that's alone reason to get exiled. Because you deserve protection from the family's relatives, and you deserve to think about it and have your life put on pause. Because your extent, Gavin, of responsibility is at least checking out the area that there's nobody there. Do you get it? It's a bit of a different to the car example, because the car example is a case where people have chosen to almost be in a hazardous situation, and that's why people die every day. But but in this particular case, a person is not expecting you to do a dangerous activity in that place. It's almost the case of the butchery, where where there's a place where the butcher chops the meat, which is in the back area, and a customer service in the front. But in a case where the butcher was doing any sort of dangerous activity with another person nearby, the statistical probability of something going wrong in a 20-year career is there. And therefore, at the very least, even the negligence part would be that you didn't make sure that to check that there was no one else around, even if it was a freak accident. But because it is a minor degree of negligence, you are entitled to the protection and atonement. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, no, all good. Makes sense.
No, because you can't go according to Rebbe. Rebbe said you're not exiled because it is gross negligence. You don't even deserve that protection, and you're going to get no atonement. So you would have to either go with
Well,
one of the sages. So you would have to
does
gravitate towards the sages here.
but I'm sorry, but does Rebbe say that it's gross negligence and that it's Karev Lamezed? Or does he say, well, it's actually not your fault at all, so therefore you're not, and it's Karev the honest, that you're not
Well,
liable at all? What does he hold by? 'Cause it's you can see it both ways.
you can't because of the second part. I think it's an excellent question, and Meforshim and Tosfot actually bring that you would have seen it both ways if not for the second portion of the Mishnah. Let's read. I was waiting for somebody to ask such a good question. So the second part says, if the death was caused by a wood chip ejected from the tree which was being chopped, let's read the sage's position. He's not exiled. Because if the sages say before, when an actual axe handle comes off, he's exiled because he's entitled to protection and atonement. In a case where you hit a tree directly and a chip falls off, if they say you're not exiled, clearly they can't think that's more negligent than the first case where the handle actually came off. So they see it less negligent. And therefore, since it's less negligent and he's not exiled, it could only be because it's considered to be an oines, a complete accident. Okay? And therefore, by contrast, Rebbe saying he's exiled means that, listen, if you hit a tree on the fifth time, but you actually hit a tree, but you weren't remiss, and a freak accident happened and a wood chip came off and killed somebody, you're entitled to be protected with the city of refuge because it's far less negligent. Can you see that you need that second part of the Mishnah? You're completely right, Gavin. Otherwise, it
Yeah,
would.
no, I see it. I see it.
So the two need to be juxtaposed. Otherwise, you could think that Rebbe could say, is it because it's bordering on accidental or is it bordering on gross negligence? It's exactly why you need the second part. It's a great question. If
Cool.
something doesn't make sense, you must tell me, but I thought it was a great question. I was hoping somebody would ask it. Okay. All right, guys, I think we can go on, but I think at this point, I don't want to go into all the commentaries or whatever. Lance isn't here. I don't want to go into the Gemara that deeply because I think he's going to be left behind. And I think Arthur is dealing with the patient. So if two are down, I think this is a reasonable thing for them to watch. And Gavin, I hope they listen to your answer in terms of where
Damon,
he's holding. Yeah.
so just explain for me, just a bit tight today, why you needed the juxtaposition. Just explain that again to me.
Sure, of course, of course. This is why I'm sharing the screen.
Thanks. Yeah, let me
Okay.
just
You needed the juxtaposition because what Gavin Simpson said is Rebbe, if you just read the first part, could say that that person is not exiled because it's almost bordering on accidental. Or you could say Rebbe is saying that it's bordering on gross negligence and therefore is not entitled to the protection nor the atonement. The only reason why his opinions is in contrast with the second part of the Mishnah, where the sages say there's no exile because it's indirect, it's groma. It's highly improbable that there was any sort of negligence whatsoever because nothing came off. The axe handle didn't come off from the axe. There wasn't even an accidental factor, and it's accidental. And by contrast, Rebbe said if you exiled on this case where it's indirect, but his store is much stricter than the rest because a Jew died. Even if there were the negligence is just the aspect of not making sure anybody's around, but you're entitled to protection from the family and you're entitled to the atonement aspect. You can only see this in juxtaposition from the first part of the Mishnah to the second. Otherwise, Gavin Simpson's right. You wouldn't know if Rebbe was holding that he's super negligent or it was super accidental.
Well, or also, Dane, you're also going to throw in the previous case of the wormy run, because that also makes it more complicated. Because we said in that particular case, the guy gets exiled, but based on Rebbe, you would have to say that the guy wouldn't get exiled. He would be liable for the go ladan. He'd be very much Kabb lemezed. It's a very similar case.
You are. In other words, if it was negligence because it was a worm-eaten run, yes. But then you have a problem with the reconciliation on the third brisos, where it talks about just the downward motion because the rung gave way, and it didn't look as if there was any issue. Would he hold by Rav Yochanan or would he hold by Rav Abahu? Rav Abahu said it's a compound motion, you go down in order to go up, but you also have a detachment where he said it was the instrument that killed wasn't the person, it was the rung, whereas Rav Yochanan said still it's a downward motion even if it's a instrument of the rung that kills, because we don't see it as a compound motion, and you pushing down was part of it because he just sees the action, not the ultimate consequence. So we don't know where Rebbe is holding on that particular aspect. It sounds like he's more stringent, and he would probably, as you said, hold by Rav Yochanan, probably, compared to the sages here. So you're right. He would do it, but we don't know for what reason. But definitely he would go with a more stringent approach, yes.
Well,
cool, guys. I hope you have a good Shabbos. I just wanted to get to the bottom line quickly. Can you see the pace is a lot quicker the last two sessions than previously? We don't have to hack an issue to death. We'll let the axe head do that to a person.
I just thought it was because I was on speed, but obviously not.
Okay. All right.
All right. No, well done. And Gavin, very good question. And Damon, well done. It was a good show. Thanks.
All right, guys. Have a good
thanks,
Shabbos.
guys.
Be well.
Great.
Thanks. See you Monday,
Have a good
Tuesday.
Shabbos.
Cheers.